There are other pitfalls you can fall into. You know, the difference between logic and everyday experience. So something might make sense logically, but not be true in the real world. So, for example, you know, one of the principles from physics is that force equals mass times acceleration. So F equals ma is a equation, a physics equation. And so if you want to solve for A, then A equals F over m, or F divided by m. So acceleration equals force divided by mass. If acceleration is 0, then the force must be 0, mathematically, right, logically. But if you've ever tried to push by yourself a heavy object across the floor, you know you can be engaged in a lot of force, but it's not accelerating, right? So the logic of the situation doesn't meet with the everyday experience. Well, why? Well, part of it is that the equation F equals ma doesn't take into consideration friction. So there's actually more complex equations in physics that take into account friction. And so friction is what's causing you to not, even though you're putting a lot of force in it, friction is what's causing the lack of acceleration. As we've said before, if you don't have a lot of information and try to make a generalization, you know, that can be problematic. Another probable pitfall is confirmation bias. Essentially, confirmation bias is looking for evidence that only supports, or excuse me, only looking for evidence that supports your position. So you've already kind of reached a conclusion about what the truth is, and so you are only paying attention to those authors or that data or that information that supports what you think already. In which case, you know, you could possibly end up with the wrong conclusion. If you ignore any sort of evidence that contradicts your position, then you're not doing research properly, you're not reaching the right conclusions, and you're not paying attention to the truth. Now, if you are accurate, you should be able to explain why there is evidence to the contrary. But if you only look for evidence that supports your position, then your reasoning process, your research process is going to be invalid. And then finally, I mean, there are other pitfalls you can fall into, but finally, one other pitfall that is a part of all this is mistaking correlation and causation. These two things are completely different. Correlation refers to things that occur together. Causation refers to one thing causing another, or one thing being the cause of another. And often, especially in psychological or sociological research, where there is a description of interactions or behaviors or outcomes, things are correlated, but people mistake them into a causation or a causal relationship. So, for example, there is a correlation between violent video games and actual violence. But there is not a causal relationship between violent video games and violence, at least as far as anything's been determined so far. What does that mean? That means that people that have been involved in mass shootings, other types of violence expressions, there seems to be a correlation between them and playing violent video games. That does not mean that playing violent video games leads to physical violence. Right? And so because you've played video violent games, you're going to go out and engage in a mass shooting. Nor does it mean that all violence is perpetrated by people that have watched, you know, so you could be violent and never have never played a violent video game. So they're correlated in the sense of they appear together frequently, but they are not causal. Right? And so one thing doesn't cause the other. So we have to be very careful that we don't get into those kind of things. Now this isn't probably something that you will necessarily worry about with your research, in the sense that, you know, you're not going to be doing correlative studies But one of the things to be careful of is more in the context of ministry, that you don't read a study, for example, that says there's a correlation between violent video games and physical violence, and then you encourage your parents of the youth group you're working with that they shouldn't allow their children to play violent video games. I mean, there's probably other reasons why they shouldn't play violent video games, but to say to a parent, well, if your children play violent video games, they're going to end up being violent people, that doesn't seem to be necessarily true, even though it might be good to discourage the playing of violent video games. We have to be careful about this correlation causation type of thing. Let's be more specific now about methods and types of research in biblical studies. So far, it's just been a review of research in general. And so now let's talk about some specifics in research. There are a couple different types of research, categories of research, but we'll look at each of these a little bit more fully. But I wanted to kind of start off with identifying the different types. There is some research which we might refer to as exegetical research, probably self-explanatory, but we'll say more a little bit here. Another type of research would be content analysis. Third would be theological research. Historical research would also be a type of research in biblical studies. And finally, what we might refer to as ministerial research. That might not be the best term. There might be other terms like congregational studies or something like practical studies. Something we'll talk more about here in a little bit. When you come to do an exegetical study, the focus of the exegetical study, of course, is the text. And since you are engaged in exegesis, you are looking for the original meaning of the text, and predominantly that is mostly your focus. And so while texts are important in other types of research, the exegetical research is really, really focused on the text. And often, again, a verse, a set of verses is predominantly the subject of the exegetical type of research or study. And so anything that is anything else is not history of interpretation, for example, how it's used in churches. Those kind of things aren't as important to exegetical research, or aren't as much of a focus. The presentation then of exegetical research ends up being focused on presenting to people or describing what the original meaning was. That would, whether that's a research paper, whether that's a sermon, whether that's a class presentation, exegetical research is predominantly focused on communicating to an audience what the meaning of the text is. And that's predominantly what you're doing. There might be some sort of discussion of application, right? Now that this is the original meaning of the text, what does that mean for us today? But it's not as big of a focus. It would be a minor focus. Now, certainly you could have kind of a mixed method approach where you engage in a couple of different types of methods, maybe an exegetical method and a theological method. But in general, exegetical research is just going to be focused on that original text. What did it mean? What do we take into consideration in order to determine that meaning? But very little on application, relatively speaking. Also very important textually, also very important when related to the text is content analysis. Content analysis is another approach that is basically focused on an intense examination of a text or set of texts. But essentially, content analysis, as you would expect given the name, is an examination of the content of a body of material. So you're systematically examining a text or a set of texts or some expression of media like a movie, a television show, a television series, a sermon series. Essentially, the idea behind content analysis is not so much exegesis as it is exploring the content of a body of work. So you might look at a content analysis of Romans, for example, or the letters of Paul, or maybe the historical books of the Old Testament, where you're not necessarily exegeting a passage, but instead you are looking for things like patterns and themes. What are some important themes that Paul brings out in Romans? That might have some exegesis done with it, but predominantly you're looking for something broader than exegesis. You're looking for things that are beyond just the meaning, the original meaning of the text. It's relying on themes, and so here are the themes. Or when Paul talks about this, he also talks about this, and so that pattern type of thinking. So exegesis might provide you some information about that, but it's serving a broader function, or it's serving a part of your broader project, I should say, than just like the exegetical research is focused on. Now, as you do biblical studies research, you're going to come across exegetical research, you're going to come across content analysis research, and you're going to come across a variety of terms or types of criticisms that have been developed by biblical studies scholars to examine texts. We don't have time right now to talk about the positives and the negatives of these processes. They can offer some helpful insights in some places. In some places, I believe that there is quite a bit of negativeness to the approach, and so it's probably not valuable. But because they are things that you will come in contact with, I wanted to give you a heads up on them. If you are a Bible major, you will explore these more as you get into, for example, critical intro to the Old Testament, critical introduction to the New Testament. So we've talked about some of these already. One type of method related to text is textual criticism. Textual criticism involves the comparison of manuscripts and manuscript variants to determine what is the most likely original meaning of the text. So, for example, textual criticism related to John chapter 8. Right, so a textual critical approach to John chapter 8 would examine all of the manuscripts that are in existence and looking at what manuscripts include the passage, what exclude the passage, what put the passage in other places. Is there a connection between those manuscripts? Those are the kind of things that a textual critic would do, is to examine the actual manuscripts, determine the meaning, or determine the most likely reading, I should say, of the text, and and have some reasonings why they would do that. And so there's principles in how to do textual criticism, etc. Historical criticism is more focused on thinking about the historical backgrounds of a specific document or text or individual. What do we learn from that time period that weighs heavily on our understanding of a text? The Greco-Roman background of the New Testament, the Hebrew and Near East, ancient Near East, and even Hellenistic backgrounds of the Old Testament. Right? All of those are thinking about historical critical approaches, thinking how that relates to the meanings of text. Source criticism we talked about when we talked a little bit about higher criticism in our survey of biblical studies way back in the beginning of the course. Source criticism refers to the idea that several documents in the Bible were composed from a variety of sources as opposed to the writings of an individual author. And so a source critic believes that they can discover the places where those different sources are brought together. again, we don't have a lot of time to go through the negatives about this, but one key thing is none of these discrete, separate, individual sources have ever been found. So they are always hypothetical. Right? There hasn't been a source found for the Pentateuch, for example, that is just pieces of Genesis and Exodus, etc. Right? And so the source critic is going on hypothesis and theories rather than any sort of identifiable manuscript evidence. Literary criticism is another approach, using the tools and theories from fields of literature to think about biblical texts. So, for example, thinking about genres of the biblical text, thinking about how a narrative is composed, thinking about how an audience might respond to specific texts, thinking about authorial intent and other issues like that. So more of a literary approach, which may or may not be interested in some of those other types of criticism. Because the focus is on the Bible or a specific book in the Bible as a piece of literature.